Hey everyone, hope you're all doing well. The holiday season is now over 2 months behind us, but I still feel like Halloween was just a couple of weeks ago, and I've still got spooky images I want to make. Back around last Halloween, I watched this video by Cambo Creation and this video by YK Design, and it sparked an idea for something I could make with some of the stocks they used that they were kind enough to link to in their video descriptions. I'll do likewise, as well as put links to their respective videos in this video's description. I'm also going to do something a little different in this video. I'm going to do the layer breakdown where I explain how I created this image, but after that will be a time lapse where you can see the whole process. I get comments from people who enjoy both, so I thought I'd put both in this video and see how you all feel about it. If you're just interested in the time lapse, then feel free to jump to that section at this time code, or use the chapter markers if the device you're watching on supports it. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave any comments or feedback, as all of that really helps me out. Thanks for watching, and now let's get started. Starting with a blank canvas at a 16:9 aspect ratio, I first brought in this image of a field. I then duplicated it and dragged it over to the right so that I have the whole canvas covered. Then blended the two images together. It doesn't have to be perfect since we're going to be building on top of this with other elements. Next, I dropped in this sky image and masked away the parts I don't need. Then brought in the chapel image and masked it into the scene. Now, I don't really like the way it's been warped into this exaggerated cartoony style. So I spent some time with Liquify and Warp to straighten it out as best I could. Then used a mask to soften the edge at the bottom here so it blends into the grass a little bit. Again, doesn't have to be perfect since I know I'll be putting fog around the chapel later. It's just a good idea not to have any harsh lines there in case they peek through. This image I'm going to use to be the main character and the focal point of the piece. After masking her out, I cleaned up the wrinkles in her dress, changed the shape of her face a little with Liquify, and use the smudge tool with a custom hairbrush to make her hair look more kind of windswept. Now to add her zombie minions. No, not that kind. Yeah, the regular kind. I placed a few of them around and varied their scales. I want them to kind of look like they're coming from the chapel. I'll be adding effects later that'll show the depth. But first, now that we've got all the main elements in place, we need to make this scene look like it's at night. So I used a channel mixer adjustment layer to darken and desaturate, since at night things are darker and desaturated. Things also have a bluer tone to them, so I used a blue photo filter adjustment to make everything slightly bluer. Then played around with an exposure adjustment to darken everything down just a little more. I knew I was going to be putting the moon above the chapel, so I went ahead and brought back some of the brightness of the underlying layer around the edges of the chapel by masking out some of that last exposure adjustment. This will be the start of the highlights being cast by the moonlight onto the scene. But before lighting the scene up, we need to have light sources. In our case, the primary source will be the moon. So before creating it, I'm going to first desaturate and color match these zomboids a little better so they match everything. With that done, I now painted in the moon with a custom moon brush, but you can use an image if you want instead. This was just easier for me. I intensified the glow by just painting with white on a blank layer and changing the blending mode to overlay or soft light. Then I painted some clouds in front of the moon with a couple of different cloud brushes. Now the secondary light source will be coming from these chapel windows. So after tracing all the windows with the pen tool and making a selection out of that, I added a solid color adjustment and gave it a kind of orangish color. Then another solid color that's a brighter yellowy goldish color. And finally a glow using an orange solid color set to linear dodge. Alright, now we can get to the fun stuff. Lighting scenes is my favorite part of the art process. Partly that may be because I'm a photographer, so I love playing with light, but it's also because I love seeing how it makes the image start to come together and look like an actual scene and not just a collage of images. So I started lighting things up by adding some edge light around the chapel coming from the moon, then moved across the image adding this same lighting to everything. Now there's a ton of ways you could do this. You can clip an exposure adjustment or a curves adjustment, hue saturation, or a levels adjustment to each element and mask in the brighter tone. You can also use blend diff to isolate those adjustments to just the brightest areas. Or if you want, you can just paint the highlights manually. Sometimes I do that too. There's so many options in Photoshop for how to accomplish what you're trying to do, and there's no one right way to do it. So just experiment and see which way works best for you. Now that we have light sources casting light, they also need to be casting shadows. Now I really only need to add a couple since the ground around the zombies' feet in the distance here are about to be covered by haze and fog. I used a few different custom brushes to paint in some mist, fog, and atmospheric haze around the image, keeping it thinner the closer to the viewer it is and thicker the further away. All that haze has helped to create some depth, but using levels, I'm going to add even more. Moving left to right again across the image, I'll start by adding a little more shadow to the chapel on the sides facing away from the moon. Then a couple more removing contrast and details, thus pushing it further into the distance. Then I did the same thing, still using level adjustments on each of the zombies. I added some more highlights to the main character here as I felt like this effect had dulled the one she had already. Next, I put a little glow along the top edges of the chapel since it's closest to the moonlight and so it would be pretty bright. Now to give all these characters some evil, undead life by lighting up the eyes. Let's make them glow with red-hot evilness. More. Don't forget the crow is also evil. I also added some dust and particles around the light sources just for a nice little detail. It lends some realism, I feel. I used a custom color lookup adjustment to get this nice tone here. Then threw this custom action effect on top of it, and this hue saturation layer along the bottom. I felt like there was a little too much empty space in the bottom left hand of the image, and after playing around with some different things, I landed on using this headstone to fill in the space in the foreground. I just need to mask it out, darken it, match the color, give it some highlights, and a little bit of haze. Next, I brought the image into Camera Raw filter and I really messed with it, massively changing color and tonal values, playing with clarity and contrast, color grading, and even distorting it a little bit. It's a lot of changes, but I really like it. A couple of details I changed next is on this zombie here, I added some extra gore to his stump and removed his crazy tongue. Then I added some blood around the mouths and chests of these two. So when I was playing around in Camera Raw, I accidentally made the chapel windows a little too dull, so I just used another color fill adjustment set to linear dodge to brighten them back up. I also realized I hadn't added any light reflection around the windows, so I did that as well. I also realized that I like the tombstone we added earlier enough that I feel like I need another one on the opposite side. So in it goes. And now the sky is looking kind of empty. So what goes in the sky? I know, birds! Same drill, give them some atmospheric haze so they look like they're far away, and add highlights from the moon. More birds. Now, this is an optional effect, but one that can look pretty cool if you're going for a kind of retro sci-fi horror movie poster look. Trace all around the main elements in your image with a white brush, then change the blending mode of that layer to soft light. Add a glow to that by drawing around that outline with a larger soft brush on a separate layer. You'll probably need to add a Gaussian blur to it after to make it even softer. Put that layer on soft light as well and lower the opacity some. Then just mask those two layers in and out all around wherever it looks good to you. There's probably an easier way to do this, maybe by using the glowing edges filter, but I feel like this way gives me the most control. After all that, I added another color grade. Now, I could have stopped here and been happy, but I really wanted to see how this could look with a painted effect on it. And man, I'm glad I listened to my instincts because it ended up looking even more badass, if I do say so myself. The first step is using a custom brush and the smudge tool to overpaint the entire image. You can see this process in more detail in the time lapse. I noticed this zombie's highlights were a little brighter than they should be, brighter than the main character even, so I just darkened them down a little. Then I applied smart sharpening to the whole thing to bring out the edges and the texture of the overpaint. Then a different paint effect, which you can also see how I did in greater detail in the time lapse. And one final round of color adjustments. There we go, all finished.